Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University. This podcast seeks to bring together the worlds of academia and professional practice. If you're interested in the latest research and trends in sport and want to hear from experts from around the world, then subscribe now, because this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Martin Foster, Applied Sport Management Lead at Loughborough University. Today we're here with Dr Georgie Bruinvels. Georgie is a research scientist at Orreco. Today's podcast focuses on female athletes and the menstrual cycle. Georgie explains how the menstrual cycle affects performance. She gives us some practical tips on how coaches can work with athletes to understand their cycle to maximise performance. And we discuss how male coaches can approach having this conversation with female athletes. Finally, we hear the effects that contraception methods can have on performance. Just to make you aware, there are a couple of short pauses and missing information in the podcast. We apologise for this. However, the information in the rest of the podcast is outstanding, and we decided to release this podcast to share some of this essential information around female athletes and the menstrual cycle. So, hi Rich, hi Georgie, thanks for coming in. Just for our listeners, can you just give us a brief explanation of who you are and what your research is? Rich, I know you're going to be doing quite a few of these with us in the future, so can you just give us a little bit of background to yourself?
Yeah, thanks a lot for inviting us in today, Martin. My name is Richard Blagrove. I'm a lecturer here at Loughborough University in Physiology, and I'm also the Programme Director for the Masters in Strength and Conditioning. Before I was here, I was leading an undergraduate degree in sport and exercise science at Birmingham City University, and before that I spent 8.5 years at St Mary's University in London leading the BSc in Strength and Conditioning Science. My research over the last few years has largely focused on the effects of strength training in post-pubertal adolescent distance runners, but at the moment I'm doing some research around female athlete physiology, specifically around the menstrual cycle and the impact of low energy availability on endurance athletes.
Awesome. So just for our listeners, Rich, we're going to probably doing a few podcasts in the future in loads of different areas. So if people are interested, get in touch, let us know what you want to know, and we'll work with Rich and develop some more insights from experts such as Georgie. So Georgie, can you give us a bit of a background to yourself, please?
Hi, thank you for having me. So my name is Georgie Bruinvels. I work for a company called Orreco, which is a sports science and data analytics company. I'm also a research associate at St Mary's University, which was where Rich was a good few years ago now. So my main research area is effectively looking at how the fluctuations in hormones through the menstrual cycle affect all different things from diet to training and to things like as simple as mood, and also better understanding risks of dysfunctions, so things like not having a period, so amenorrhea or heavy menstrual bleeding, better understanding risk factors towards them. Alongside that, I am the co-creator of FitrWoman, which I'm sure we'll talk about more, but that's effectively a program that we've developed at Orreco to support female athletes.
Brilliant. We definitely will, because I've read about that. So we'll definitely talk about that. So thanks for your introduction. From here, I'll pretty much pass the reins over to Rich. But as people be aware, in many other podcasts, I might jump in with some layman kind of questions, just if we need them, to make sure we're all understanding what's going on. So, awesome. Rich, I know you've got your questions. Over to you.
Yeah, sounds good. I guess a lot of these questions stem from my background as a strength and conditioning coach, but I've worked obviously with a lot of technical sports coaches over the years. And I've always been aware that the practitioners that I've worked alongside have definitely got some knowledge of sex differences, so differences between males and females, particularly in terms of biomechanical differences and physiological differences. But I don't actually think that a lot of coaches, and especially a lot of strength and conditioning coaches, really take those into account. So, as a coach, when I'm writing a programme for a female athlete regarding the menstrual cycle specifically, what sorts of things would you perhaps recommend that I'm initially trying to find out about the menstrual cycle in terms of a screening process?
Yeah, good question. So the first thing, I guess, is addressing this big kind of historical taboo of the menstrual cycle. Historically, people haven't wanted to talk about it. It's been deemed an area of like significant embarrassment. And I think from a practitioner perspective, the first thing I would always say is to let's get the conversation going. Now, that's obviously easier said than done, but I think stepping back and looking at the menstrual cycle objectively as hormones are fluctuating, and yes, there is a bleed, and yes, maybe that's a bit gross, but actually hormones are fluctuating in a cyclical manner, and we need to kind of really kind of tackle it head on. As I said, we've got an app and a program that helps develop that, and I can talk about that later. But I think essentially as a practitioner, you need to first establish if your athlete is menstruating regularly, or whether they're using hormonal contraception, or if they've got any underlying menstrual dysfunctions. And we've actually developed a questionnaire specifically for that, and I would strongly suggest anyone who's working with female athletes to come up with some way of establishing whether an athlete has a atypical or a typical cycle, so a normal cycle, so bleeding every 21 to 35 days, what symptoms are being experienced, and I would suggest getting athletes to track menstrual cycle would be really impactful. I would say as a practitioner, if an athlete is menstruating regularly, then I know immediately that that's actually quite a good indicator that the athlete is in a relatively healthy state, so their body is saying they can have a child. Men don't have that nuance to them, so actually it's a real clever way of knowing quite a few things are working in a female body.
Excellent. And I guess just sort of picking up on one of those areas that you mentioned initially, if you've got a coach, and I guess this might be a lot of male coaches that are maybe a little embarrassed about talking about these things with the female athletes that they're working with, do you have any advice for how they can try and open up this type of discussion?
Looking at this hormonal fluctuations, as the menstrual cycle is a whole cycle, it's not just menstruation. So bodies to record a podcast to help explain the menstrual cycle and actually what is happening through the menstrual cycle, because often I think the conversation is awkward because people don't really understand it, that the physiology behind it. So I think somehow or some way of getting education to athletes is really, really important, and coaches. We've actually developed, as I was saying, this app, FitrWoman. It's a free app that people can download, FitrWoman, and that helps athletes track their cycle and understand more about it. We've also got a coach platform now, so Fitter Coach, which if athletes want, they can link up their app to the coach's app, and that provides a way of having a conversation that isn't, I guess it's more silent. And yes, I don't want that to mean you don't talk about it at all, but it can, it's more discreet. You don't necessarily want athletes coming up to you before training and saying, oh, I've got terrible cramps today, when actually you could see that on the app and pre-prepare for it effectively, so when an athlete gets to training that this is going on. But I think taking away firstly getting some education, understanding athlete statuses, so are they menstruating, are they using a pill, are they using another form of hormonal contraception, and then literally just tackling it head on and almost trying not to be acknowledging it's a difficult subject, but then actually just going for it and looking at it objectively, as I said.
Yeah, that all makes sense. I think what might be quite useful for the listeners if we maybe pick up on some of the, I guess, most typical scenarios or most typical characteristics and dysfunctions that we might see with female athletes, and perhaps what sort of advice you've got about programming and coaching those types of athletes. And so if me as a coach, I'm working with a female athlete who I'm pretty convinced is healthy. They're eumenoric, so essentially that means they've got a normal menstrual cycle pattern, and they're a hormonal contraceptive user, do you think that our understanding of menstrual cycle physiology, so the fluctuations that we're getting in the hormones, can actually help a coach design training around this kind of 28-day typical pattern that we see?
Yeah, great question. And this is something I'm really excited to keep working on more with some of the teams that we're working with at Orreco. Now, there is some research to suggest that effectively phasing, so strength conditioning training around the menstrual cycle, can lead to more positive benefits. So focusing on, say, the first half of the cycle is like a build phase, and the second half of the cycle is a maintain phase. I know that the All Black Rugby Sevens do this, for example. Rich, this is your area as well, so I'm sure we've spoken about this at length. But I think, actually, from your perspective, what do you think? What would you suggest in your applied setting?
I think in terms of strength training, there doesn't seem to be that much evidence that strength status varies too much across the menstrual cycle, and so I don't think that female athletes should be put off that if they're getting menstrual cycle symptoms, or if they know that they're approaching ovulation, that they don't think they can perform the strength training that the coach has set them. Having said that, there's probably still quite a lot more work that needs to be done in terms of research around if the hormonal environment, particularly around ovulation, might be quite beneficial for strength adaptation. So if we try and load up a female athlete around ovulation, for example, they might get more benefit from doing that strength training compared to another part of the cycle. So I know it's an area that we're hoping to do some research in.
And as I said, so there's a group in New Zealand or a group of athletes in New Zealand who are actively implementing that training strategy, and I'm pretty sure GB Hockey did something similar as well in the build up to the Rio Olympics. So I think there's a lot more research to be done, but I think there's definite potential here, and whether it's just that there's different ratios of hormones help with recovery or adaptation to the training, that's yet to be further understood.
Yeah, I think another area in terms of injury implications, there's been quite a decent body of literature over the years that's looked at ACL injury, so injury to a specific ligament within the knee, and it seems that females have got a higher predisposition to getting ACL type injuries in the sort of 5 or 6 days leading into ovulation, and so that might be a period of time within the menstrual cycle when a coach is programming that you might want to avoid things like high intensity plyometrics, change of direction work, so agility type training sessions, particularly when a female athlete is quite heavily fatigued off the back of technical training or some sort of endurance training.
Definitely, and we also know that obviously estrogen and progesterone fluctuate in a cyclical manner through this typical 28-day cycle, and because these hormones travel in the blood, they, as Rich said, they can affect things like anterior cruciate ligament laxity, and they can also affect things like mood, and they can affect metabolism of different macronutrients. So, for example, research has demonstrated that in the first half of the cycle, when both estrogen and progesterone are low, and then when estrogen increases, a primary fuel source at lower intensities is fats, and then in the second half of the cycle, in the effectively high hormone phase, so when both estrogen and progesterone are high, the body is more dependent on fats as a fuel source. Carbohydrates in the first half, fats in the second half at a lower intensity, and then obviously at high intensity we're very much bound by carbohydrates as a primary fuel source. There's also research going on looking at different abilities to process information at different times in the menstrual cycle.
Excellent. I guess the next question really focuses on any sorts of athletes that are probably in weight category sports, like certainly endurance athletes, so a lot of the distance runners that I've worked with over the years, but also aesthetic sports such as dancers and gymnasts. But we often see with athletes in those sports that they have quite irregular length menstrual cycles. So during a low volume block of training, they might have a menstrual cycle of around 28 days. When they're in higher volume training and they're perhaps trying to lose lose some body fat, that might go to 35 days, it might go to 40 days, and then they might have a complete absence of menstrual cycles, which is known as secondary amenorrhea. Can you just explain why that's a bad thing, so an absence of menstrual cycles, and what a coach can maybe do to address this?
Yeah, so an absence of menstrual cycles, as I said at the beginning, like not having a menstrual or having a menstrual cycle is a good indicator of health. So an absence of a menstrual cycle demonstrates that something isn't quite right. Now, there's a whole range of different things that can cause this, and as you mentioned, secondary amenorrhea, so where athletes have had menarche, so they have had periods and then they suddenly stop, and that's typically, I wouldn't look at that until at least a year after the onset of menstruation initially, as I wouldn't think it was significant until then. Now, any form of stress on the HPA axis, so the kind of system that controls the reproductive hormones, any form of stressor to that system can cause menstruation to stop. So that can be not on the body, which can then prevent regular menstrual cycles. And now, from a coach perspective, the first thing to do, I would say, is to step back and look at these factors and consider like whether there's something obvious that's going on or not going on here. I would always say that a medical professional needs to be looped in instantly as well to ensure that there's no other underlying issue going on. And then it's consulting with extra kind of support personnel, so nutritionists.
Yeah.
We're talking about athletes a lot. Does this translate to the general population?
Definitely, yeah.
100%, or is it obviously the extra stress of training? Previously I've heard things of like low body fat. Might affect this.
Definitely.
Where are we with that?
Yeah. So there's a lot of research going on trying to find out exactly what drives the stopping of menstruation, and there has been a lot of hypotheses around low body fat. But I think in terms of the general population, like this still absolutely applies, and I would strongly suggest looking at diet, lifestyle, training volume. Like obviously I didn't even mention training. Like if training volume goes from being low to suddenly very high, the body's going to be stressed. So anything that puts stress on the body can cause this stopping of periods, and it's how the body handles that that's really important. But it's not normal for anyone to not have a period, and that needs to be addressed medically in its first instance. But from a coach perspective, I think I would suggest encouraging the athlete to go and seek secondary help as quickly as possible.
Great. And certainly from a research and scientific perspective, there's obviously a whole load of hormones that we can measure in labs and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But from a coach's perspective, like it's often said that just tracking body mass isn't actually sensitive enough, and keeping things like food diaries again might not give enough insight into whether the athlete is taking on board enough energy.
Because it's very much about when you eat as much as what you're eating. Well, what you eat, when you eat, and how much you're eating. It's all of them, and it's ensuring that your body isn't. You need to keep your body fueled up effectively. And different points in the menstrual cycle is actually more important than others for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And is there any kind of behavioural type characteristics that perhaps you might pick up in an athlete if you think they might be entering a state of low energy availability?
Yeah, I think obviously it depends why, because actually increasingly from the work I've done, I found that lots of athlete cycles start varying. So they tend to go from having a normal menstrual cycle to becoming oligomenoric, which is a regular cycle, so sort of 35 days or more between cycles, and then you amenorrhea comes after that. I would say looking at athletes getting ill more regularly, not adapting to training, not I guess like psychological worries, firstly seeing that they're under psychological stress, but also getting more and more anxious about their performance. Obviously dietary factors, if you see that they don't seem to have their recovery drink after training, recovery fuel after training, and have experience weight loss. Other things around that can be gastrointestinal problems, iron deficiencies, cardiac problems. There's a whole host of different things as part of this relative energy deficiency in sport model, which some people may have heard of, but there's a whole load of different aspects to be aware of. But I would strongly suggest people seeking medical input in the first instance.
Yeah. And the menstrual cycle obviously being a sort of key barometer that we can use to try and detect athletes that are entering potentially this kind of risky zone of energy availability.
Once you've got the conversation going.
Absolutely, yeah. The tricky hurdle to overcome. I guess something that a lot of females will experience is menstrual cycle related symptoms that might come about just before menstruation or happen during menstruation. Like I kind of understand that it's quite varied.
Yeah.
But is there anything that females can do, just not just athletes, just the general public that exercise, to try and reduce those symptoms, like exercise interventions or manipulations to diet and so on, so they don't have to change or miss training?
Absolutely. So this is an area which I feel like really passionate about, because we want to remove barriers for people to keep exercising and performing at their best. And that's a large motivation behind creating our FitrWoman app, because we provide all of that information on a daily basis based on where an individual is in their menstrual cycle. But we know that diet is very powerful at influencing symptoms. So eating like highly processed foods, or foods high in saturated fat, or not eating enough fruit and vegetables, for example, can all cause symptoms to be worse. Not eating enough fibre, not eating any fish, or foods low in magnesium. I mean, it's very individual as to how sensitive your body is, but essentially, like, food is a very powerful way of helping to manage symptoms. Like, we take anti-inflammatories to reduce the pain of symptoms because they are largely inflammatory. So as hormones drop off premenstrually, this drives this whole process which involves an increase in inflammation, and that's partly what causes some of the symptoms. So actually, if we look at focusing on a really anti-inflammatory diet in that window, then that can really positively help. So I believe in helping people help themselves, so educating them about their menstrual cycles and what their hormonal fluctuations mean. So absolutely, dietary manipulations are really, really powerful. We also know that exercise is helpful in terms of improving mood. There's a large body of evidence to suggest the increased release of endorphins as a result of exercise, but also exercise can have anti-inflammatory properties. And we've just done this massive research study with Strava, which Rich is involved with as well, looking at 14,184 women and looking at how they believe, as one of the things we're looking at, exercise relates to menstrual symptoms. And I think 79% of women felt that some form of exercise helps to treat menstrual symptoms, and moderate intensity exercise seemed to be the most powerful. So that's hard, fast breathing, but able to hold a conversation. That's the definition of it. So I think there are lots of things to do. I think sometimes the old belief about sitting in bed with a hot water bottle needs to be completely thrown out of the window. Sometimes we know that heat can be comforting, so that might be a solution depending on the circumstances. But I really strongly believe being proactive and not just accepting being in pain for a few days every single menstrual cycle is normal, because there are things that can be done about it.
So you touched upon the app. Can you just give us self-promote it, do whatever you want? Can you just give us insight into what the app does? Because you've touched on it a little bit. Just give us a little bit more on that.
Oh, thank you. So we developed the app on the back of, my first PhD study, which found that basically it was initially about heavy menstrual bleeding, doing a big survey asking people about whether they've had heavy menstrual bleeding. But then I found, like, speaking to over 1,000 women, I realised that they want to know about their menstrual cycles, and going to Dr Google and asking whether I can still exercise when I'm bleeding, or is there a certain type of thing I should be doing, or is it normal to experience a ton of symptoms, etc. There was not the education out there, so we came up with the idea of developing this app, FitrWoman, to effectively inform women about their physiology, so what's going on in their body, what training, based on research, everything is based on research, what training has been demonstrated to be best at certain times in the menstrual cycle, whether there's any cautions around injury risk and what can be done about that. Also, what nutrition would be advised at certain times in the menstrual cycle, and we've thrown a ton of recipes in there. We've got foods to avoid, foods to have at certain time points. Alongside that, everyone's different. Me and Rich always talk about this. Every woman is different. different. And so getting them to track their cycle and their symptoms helps them to learn about their individual cycle so they can take ownership as well. We've also just partnered with Strava, so all of their exercise data comes into that, so you can see it's all kind of nicely aligned. And alongside that, we share a load of information about like ways to help yourself sleep, or what are different types of menstrual dysfunctions, or what is resistance training. So there's a whole kind of breadth of other information that we've put in there.
Brilliant. It sounds awesome. We'll make sure when we send this out, we'll put the link on for it.
Thank
and
you
make sure
so
people
much.
can see it and all that.
Plus, there's some advice from me on plyometric.
I was just about to say, Rich is on our sort of FitrWoman panel, so
perfect. We'll put that out for you as well, Rich.
Thanks very much. Just jumping back, to the conversation we were having previously around females that do some form of exercise when they experience menstrual symptoms, and whether their perception is that it reduces them. And we've got, so this is like results hot off the press almost, 80% of women think that some form of exercise helps their menstrual symptoms, and the majority, so 50% of them, think that moderate intensity exercise is the best, as opposed to low intensity exercise or vigorous exercise. So these results aren't published yet, but this is just analysis that's we've been done in the last week. I just wanted to finish off with, obviously so far we've spoken about females that do or don't have menstrual cycles, but obviously there's a lot of females that take oral contraceptive pills. So I think in the survey that we've done, it was around about 30% of the respondents, but there's other surveys.
Oral contraceptive pills, there's intrauterine devices, there's the implant. Sure. I know other surveys, other countries, it's more than 50%, up to sort of 60%. How does taking one of these hormonal contraceptives or an oral contraceptive affect the pattern of exercise that women can participate in, and is there anything that a coach should kind of be aware of? Okay, so first thing is there's two types of hormonal contraception. So there's the combined type, so that's with a type of hormonal contraception that's a pill, a vaginal ring, and the pill and the vaginal ring, just those two, which can contain two hormones. So they contain ethinyl estradiol, which is a type of estrogen, and a progestogen. And the way combined hormonal contraception works is to suppress our natural hormones, so endogenous internal hormones, and put in like artificial hormones. So there's no menstrual cycle, there's a pill cycle. So hormone levels are relatively constant through a typical 21-day period, and then there's a placebo week, so where an individual just takes a placebo pill and they have a bleed. Now that's not a normal bleed, that's like a pill-induced bleed. And so in terms of what a practitioner should know, effectively an athlete is more stable, in a more stable environment when they're using this combined type of hormonal contraception. However, there's lots of research going on to better understand the long-term consequences of this. Like, we know that combined pill use can increase in baseline inflammation and oxidative stress, but then maybe it could be protective for certain injuries. So there's lots more research to be understood. But in terms of, from a coach's perspective, I think being aware of when the athlete is taking the pill and when they're not taking the pill is really important, because those hormonal changes, the drop-offs in hormones and increases in hormones, still can have an effect. Still can cause the body to have to kind of metabolize these and readjust to kind of suit them. Then there's the other type of hormonal contraception, which is progestogen only. And so that works from a contraceptive perspective, completely different. So often, depending on the type, depending on the amount of progestogen, athletes may still have a normal menstrual cycle, and they may still ovulate, and they may still bleed and have a normal period. So in that instance, things aren't really that different. So from a practitioner perspective, they can still check their cycle, they can use FitrCoach if they want to, but they can still do everything as per normal. It may be that ovulation doesn't happen and hormones are blunted, but in terms of fluctuations, then that they still occur.
Excellent. That's really, really interesting.
So just to kind of wrap up on things, I know you touched on this before. What would that perfect advice be? I know we can use Fit a Coach, but that perfect advice, perfect, as I say, to a coach to approach this situation, or to an athlete to approach this situation, what would you recommend?
So educating themselves, educating both the coach and the athlete, so understanding firstly what is normal effectively, and also what's going on. I think as people it's so important to understand what's going on in our bodies and what we can do about it. And I think once we understand what's going on, we can appreciate the risk factors for having a dysfunction, for having bad symptoms. So education first, then trying to understand, for a coach, I think understanding current menstrual status. So are they menstruating regularly? Do they have any history of any problems? Do they have any symptoms that are significant and need to be followed up, say? Understanding that and having the discussion. Somehow having that discussion. I'm really trying to work on educational resources to help initiate that. Podcasts like this are great because, a coach could say, well, go and listen to that podcast. We need to talk about this. So I think things like that can be really, really useful. And then it's normal and natural and it's a good sign of health. So I want to try and reframe the whole area. And while it's great that we've had press, we've had some really cool summer of working with the US women's national team, US soccer, and that's great to help normalise the conversation. But it's crazy that it's newsworthy, really. In 10 years' time, while I hate to say this, I don't want it to be making headlines. I want it to be normal, natural, and we train women as women and men as men, and that's a perfectly normal state of play.
I think that's a really good place to leave it. There's so much we could ask you, and I think hopefully in the future we'll harass you again and get you to come back in, because there's so many questions that I could ask, and I'm sure Rich has got many, many more. So I'd just like to thank you for coming in. We'll make sure that the app and any of the press and things like that, we'll put that out there when we put this out there. And keep doing what you're doing. It sounds really exciting.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thanks, Georgie. Some great insights into how the menstrual cycle can affect performance and how coaches can approach the subject to maximise the performance of athletes. If you're an athlete that wants to look at this in more detail, then I'd recommend downloading the FitrWoman app. And if you're a coach that wants a better understanding of the menstrual cycle and your athletes, then you may want to download the FitrCoach app that Georgie explained earlier. If you want to get in touch and let us know any subject areas or experts that you'd be keen to listen to, then contact me, Martin Foster, on m.foster@loughborough.ac.uk or tweet me at martinfoster82. Bye for now. We'll see you next time.